Well, Rehnuma Sazzad is a research fellow at the School of Advanced Study, the University of London, and an external lecturer in the Department of English and American Studies at the University of Regensburg. She's an associate editor and reviews editor, of the Journal of Postcolonial Writing, and an editorial advisory board member for Journal of English Association. Her first monograph, The Concept of Exile, published by Bloomsbury in 2017, adds new depth to discourses of resistance, home, and identity. She's completing her second monograph for Palgrave Macmillan and is co-editing a volume on Négritude and editing a collection on decolonizing the curriculum. And I will hand over to Rehnuma for her talk this afternoon. Thank you so much, Rehnuma. We're really looking forward to this.
Thank you, Diana. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you all for coming. So in this lecture, I argue that the legacies of Aimé Césaire and Derek Walcott are fundamental to decolonization movement in the Caribbean, though their approaches to the colonial past and cultural hybridity differ significantly. Trying to move the slide, it's not moving, so try to share again. Sorry for... Are the slides moving?
Rehnuma, you've taken the slides from they're not.
Yeah, I'm
now.
Trying to
if
share
you want,
again.
I can load them for you. Would you like me to do it?
Just a second. Let me try again. And okay, so it wasn't moving previously. Is it moving now? Probably I should try this way. Is it all right? Can you view the slide?
We can see the slides.
Okay. The discussion on decolonization between Césaire and Walcott offers two distinct yet interconnected perspectives from the Caribbean. Born in Martinique, Césaire won a scholarship to study in Paris, where he met future decolonial figures like Léopold Senghor and became a co-founder of Négritude, a forceful affirmation of Black identity. The young scholar drew inspiration from the Harlem Renaissance, which was a New York-centered African-American movement in as in politics to preserve of African cultural heritage, which Césaire and his scholar friends employed in their opposition to French assimilationist policies. On the contrary, the Saint Lucian poet and playwright who received the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1992 was of African, English, and Dutch descent. Walcott was born in 1930 on Saint Lucia, an island then belonging to the British Empire, which gained independence in 1979. Walcott's father, Derek Walcott, was a painter and died when he was very young, and his mother, Alex, a school teacher, who instilled the enthusiasm for the arts in him and raised him. And he taught literature at Boston University for over 2 decades, founding the Boston Playwrights Theatre there in 1981. Undoubtedly, the poet, playwright, and painter was inspired by the diverse region of islands of the Caribbean surrounding the Atlantic that represent a complex history, which he terms the theater of the sea. Let me do this. Normally it does. Sorry for the...
Rehnuma, if you press on the tab on the left-hand side that says 3, you'll be able to change your slide.
Yeah, I've tried that. It's just frozen for some reason. Okay, I'll try the full share and see if that's better. Okay, it's moving. Good. Okay. Before moving on to their contributions to the decolonization movement, I'd like to clarify what I understand by the concept, as we can comprehend formal independence governmental power, and the membership of the United Nations are not synonymous with emancipation of the previously colonized territories. Apparently, removing the colonial control, proclaiming sovereignty, and forging autonomous policies are not the ultimate indicators of state sovereignty. In accordance with A.G. Hopkins' 2008, I believe that decolonization was a response to the post-Second World War global realities. The colonial systems subordinated non-European regions by governing them from metropolitan centers. The upheaval of the Second World War only led to the opposition of the hierarchical imperial structure, but also not only led to the opposition of the hierarchical imperial structure, but also supported the rise of concepts regarding human rights and civil rights, which encouraged claims of ethnic superiority, since the massive post-imperial challenges in global economy created new alignments and increasingly underlined a cosmopolitan world. In this context, political decolonization became part of the profound processes of socio-economic reorientation of a rapidly changing world. In fact, decolonization was one of the results, probably one of the most prominently exhibited and most loudly argued of the socio-economic processes under intensifying pressures of governance, institutionalization, and global contacts. From this perspective, decolonization remains a movement, a phenomenon that is still taking shape. Part of this phenomenon constitutes the realization of anti-colonial theorists that European colonialists generated knowledge and established it in the colonized society to dominate, downgrade, and repress the autochthonous ways of knowing. Therefore, decolonization movement highlights that unless the previously colonized people create impactful counter-discourses revealing the function of colonial privileges, their worldviews have every reason to perish in their sights. One of the aspects of the counter-discourses involves introspection. In the words of Southeast Asian historian Wang Gungwu, what did those who found themselves decolonized actually get? Indeed, decolonization movement compels us to inquire how we realize the meaning of national freedom. In other words, this is not simply a movement about liberating institutions like museums and higher education platforms from colonial practices. It also involves taking stock of the actual reality of being decolonized, particularly due to the regrettable fact that political freedom in previously colonized places was followed by an increasing sense of dissatisfaction. In many aspects of life, decolonization didn't usher in the dramatic transformation that nationalist discourses have assumed and are promised. Therefore, it is impossible to define decolonization without referring to its main challenges to bring about stable and prosperous societies. One of the main causes for this massive challenge lies in the difficulty of the previously colonized societies to transition into modernity, despite the tremendous roadblocks in the form of the exploitative history of colonial rule, dissimilar paces of transformation in various parts of the newly independent countries, and the socio-political instabilities as the after effects of the liberation process. And this explains why we need to keep analyzing the decolonial legacies championed by thinkers like Césaire and Walcott. More importantly, they represent the colonial division between the English-speaking and French-speaking Caribbean, though the insularity can be mitigated not only by the decolonial pursuit of preserving the landscapes, heritages, and stories of the regions, but also through the common concerns for rediscovering economic and cultural strengths. To reiterate, if the blackness of the two writers is neither an instance of serendipity nor a mystery, a geographical positioning combines them objectively. The greatest Anglophone and Francophone poets of the Caribbean region belong to Saint Lucian, Martinique, respectively, which are both part of the Lesser Antilles, especially within the southern part known as the Windward Islands. However, the writer's approaches to decolonization differ, as I mentioned at the beginning. While Césaire directly opposes the political and ethical foundations of colonialism, Walcott grapples directly. Césaire's approaches to decolonization differ, as I mentioned at the beginning. While Césaire directly opposes the political and ethical foundations of colonialism, Walcott grapples with its complex cultural effects. A discussion about their roles in the decolonization movement provides a rich platform for understanding the phenomenon not just as a political process, but also as a cultural and even personal one. Césaire's life bears witness to a lived dilemma between assimilation and an anti-colonial project. As an elected official in the French administration, he proposed the legislation for Martinique's departmentalization, which was passed in the National Assembly in Paris on 14 March 1946. This was viewed as an initial form of decolonization of the place, since the legislature was believed to secure for Martinicans the same social welfare provision and workplace rights available to their post-World War II metropolitan counterparts. Configured thus, the push for departmentalization from Martinique can be interpreted as a form of anti-colonial movement, whilst simultaneously ensuring the colonized people's entitlement to the imperial power's resources. The benefits of the duality can be translated as the Martinicans being admitted within the parameters of French law, public infrastructure, and commercial enterprise. Assimilation, republic, department, this is the political lexicon employed by the Martinicans, regardless of their interpretations of the island's history or their future aspirations. And yet, to be confined by the vocabulary is to interpret this area as a mere French Antilles dyad, rather than accounting for the complex institutional and socio-economic interdependence of the decolonial and imperial societies. Being strongly critical of the colonial society, however, Césaire became a high priest of decolonization when the concept gained ground during the 2000s, due to his idea that true independence was not just about raising a new flag. It was about dislodging the deep-seated cultural inferiority imposed on the Caribbean people by centuries of colonialism and racism. Consequently, his writings encouraged a generation of Caribbean and African intellectuals like Franz Fanon to challenge European dominance. I will soon address, albeit briefly, Fanon's relevance in this lecture. However, we need to concentrate now on how Césaire's contribution to the decolonization of the Caribbean materializes through representing the historical conditions of cultural production in Martinique in order to reconfigure an Afro-Caribbean identity that is yet to take shape. This reconfiguration is most evident in Notebook of a Return to the Native Land, where the Martinicans' economic situation and the severity of the form of production they're engaged in are emphasized, making it extremely difficult to envisage for us, the new readers perhaps, the exquisiteness that tourists and colonizers usually associate with the colonial space. The lethargic town and the silent multitude represent the harsh socio-economic condition that renders impossible a true form of emancipation. Being historically deprived of the means of self-representation, the people seemed to be disconnected not only from the root causes of various types of hardships, but also from the space they inhabited. Césaire deemed that his people were estranged from themselves and from their environments. The history of dispossession, extraction of resources, and racial injustice seemed to constitute the Antillean here and now. As a form of redemption, Césaire proposed to organize the people around a collective past represented in African civilization and a kind of persistence of the past, the knowledge of an abiding African civilization, the possibility of guaranteeing a perpendicular solidarity among cultures of the African descendants, and the unity to resist the work of colonization created a journey of renewal for Césaire, who advocated the sustenance of a common past that had been lost due to colonialism. For Césaire, the conditions for cultural creation sourced by this awareness call first for an end of the colonial system. Following John Drabinski's recent argument in his book, Atlantic Theory on the Vicissitudes of Relation, 2025, I argue that Césaire's belief in apocalypse is suggestive of his hope in a future that holds the key to unlocking the potential for creating the marvelous in terms of an evolved human existence, where all races have their self-knowledge affirmed and exalted. In the apocalyptic moment, then, the landscape that hosts the bioluminescent organisms and works as an embodied history is able to sustain the life of creative economy. This dramatizes the source of an unprecedented courage for ending the tragedy of colonialism, which finally awakens Césaire from his torpor to announce that he can demand the impossible. And I quote, "Absurdities under the splashing of my open conscience, tragic futilities lit up by this single noctiluca, and I alone, sudden stage of this daybreak, when the apocalypse of monsters cavots then capsized, hushes, warm election of cinders, of ruins and collapses," unquote. The senses cleansed of coloniality and uplifted by the marvelous hope of survival are the revolutionary goals of Césaire's apocalyptic vision. As Drabinski elaborates, quote, "The apocalyptic word then redeems torpor and the abject body in the same measure that it eschews a relation to history and memory. Apocalypse destroys the historical relation and thereby liberates memory from the pain of the past," unquote. In the Afro-Caribbean context, the prophesied apocalypse is a means of achieving distance from the history of abjection brought on both the bodies and landscapes of the inhabitants, since these memories keep creating anxieties about the past, present, and future. Put differently, if history is nothing but an experience of catastrophe, if survival is nothing but an accumulation of fragmented memories and realities of the island, they'll keep generating circular movements between colonial and anti-colonial modes of existence. Therefore, Césaire's poetry initiates a negotiation with the discomforting truth, which leads him to gather the courage to demand an end of the indecisive cycle so that the people can turn their backs on the decayed condition of the space. A very brief comparison with Fanon will make Césaire's position clearer. Césaire started a metaphorical journey back to Africa due to the dejected condition of the Martinicans, whereas Fanon advocated a total transformation of a colonial space. In both cases, decolonization becomes a possibility for rising like a phoenix from the ashes of colonial destruction of one's identity, knowledge, and culture. The Césaire's apocalyptic moment works as an interlude for the Fanonian reconstruction of the colonial world. This allows us to comprehend the contours of the fraught dynamics between Négritude and Fanon's existentialism, which is explained in Black Skin, White Masks as the Black person's dissociation from the seemingly unending cycle of all his efforts that are aimed at achieving a white existence. This is neither for emulating Europe nor for idealizing Africa. Instead, the radical hope for working towards an unheard of future where blackness and whiteness coexist, not as indicators for specific values, but as a process that neither essentializes nor alienates the individual despite her proximity to a different race. The path forward is constituted by replacing the seemingly self-supporting structure of all-consuming white identity with a framework that facilitates the fundamental ability of an individual to determine her cultural existence. And I quote Fanon, "Have I no other purpose on earth than but to avenge the Negro of the 17th century? In this world, which is already trying to disappear, do I have to pose the problem of Black truth? Do I have to be limited to the justification of a facial confirmation? I, as a man of color, do not have the right to seek to know in what respect my race is superior or inferior to another race," unquote. Clearly, what the Caribbean authors instill in us is a staunch belief for demanding structural reform through self-reform of a previously colonized subject. And yet, Walcott's life project was the empowerment of the Caribbean people in a different way, which aimed to create an authentic voice for them. He moved beyond the replication of European forms, blending them with West Indian patois, folklore, and landscapes to create a creolized style. For him, the Caribbean people are surrounded not simply by historical emptiness, but more importantly, by the sea of possibility. Their shipwreck is a chance to become a new Adam and name their own world. In his noble lecture, Walcott states, quote, "There is a force of exaltation, a celebration of luck, when a writer finds himself a witness to the early morning of a culture that is defining itself branch by branch, leaf by leaf, in that self-defining dawn, which is why, especially at the edge of the sea, it is good to make a ritual of the sunrise," unquote. The force of delight and celebration of serendipity, along with a deep commitment to invent a fresh language and a fresh people, have defined Walcott's project to convincingly represent his complex Caribbean cosmos, a polyglot place, an archipelago determined to survive the lack of historical sustenance. It could be intriguing that from early on, Walcott expressed a deep sense of privilege for the opportunity to speak not just about his own Caribbean experience, but also around everything that is incorporated in it. And I quote from his poem Midsummer. 40 years gone, in my island childhood, I felt that the gift of poetry had made me one of the chosen, that all experience was kindling to the fire of the muse," unquote. Turning everything into a copious muse means that Walcott's poetry has taken many shapes, though the core remains the same, being a voice for the Caribbean as a place that, despite its history of colonization and slavery, have developed a vibrant decolonized standing. Therefore, the poetry became a vehicle for the poet's fury against racism, against the groups that still regard the Caribbean people as rootless, against the indelible presence of poverty, acting as legacies of slavery and colonialism, against preventing the idea of the West Indian Federation from being implemented, for example. Walcott is ultimately a poet of affirmations about the power of earth, which has the authority to transcend history's unpredictability, retribution, and tragedy by initiating a renaming of the conquered sphere. The ability to create a redemptive and joyous calling through evocative language and conceptual eloquence for a challenge-filled decolonized terrain remains Walcott's life work. This is not to undermine the brutality of history like slavery, but he demonstrated that to be perpetually fixed in the past was another form of imprisonment. His work acknowledges historical sufferings, but concentrates on creating a vision that transcends the colonial image of the Caribbean as either a picturesque or as a savage wilderness. Thus, Walcott's contribution to decolonization comes from endowing the Caribbean people with a soul, a history, and a voice. For example, Dream on Monkey Mountain, 1967, is an allegorical play that takes place on an unnamed island in the Caribbean, where a jailed black man has a dream in which a white goddess convinces him to become an African king with his former jailer, Corporal Lestrade, as his new enforcer. During his interrogation, Lestrade self-importantly insists on using English, though the play's protagonist, Macaque, keeps reverting to French. Lestrade learns that Macaque lives on Monkey Mountain but cannot remember his real name. When asked his race, Macaque replies, "Tired." Nevertheless, Walcott's utilization of folkloric elements, West Indian patois, chants and fables, and mythical figures rooted in African and Christian traditions connected by fantasy facilitates the emergence of the new form of Caribbeanness that will allow for the molding of the community's improved relationship to thought, economy, and society. Walcott displays the folkloric elements within the hallucinations of the play's protagonist, Macaque, allowing dreams and deliriums to create a vibrant range of popular Caribbean performance modes, which are impeccably interwoven with contemporary stage technology and theatrical conventions followed in the European tradition. Thus, the play becomes a dramatic affirmation of the West Indian search for a meaningful existence after achieving independence. To reiterate, Walcott's designation of the setting of the play as a West Indian island is simultaneously general and concrete. While not tied to a particular nation, Dream on Monkey Mountain is specific to the nation-building challenges in the Caribbean. The play works as an inventory of the problems and opportunities involved in building a new Caribbean nation. Building any new Caribbean nation has to come up against the fact that Négritude restores dignity to the African descendants, but cannot offer a solution to the unique reality of the Caribbean constituted of varied cultures and races. The lack of direction in the nation-building process is further signaled by another central character, Mustique, who is skeptical of Macaque's claim to African royalty and yet believes in benefiting from his glorious vision of Africa. Instead of endorsing Macaque's dream, then, Mustique continuously rebuts it with capitalism. At every turn, he reminds Macaque of two inescapable facts of a decolonized polity. The people have debts to repay, and given their constraints, everything is saleable, even dreams. After Macaque's messianic performance at the crossroads as a redeemer of his race, Mustique reveals his plans to capitalize on Macaque's supposed healing capacity. Macaque refuses to sell his power, but Mustique responds, quote, "Look, I tired telling you that nothing is for free, that someday, Macaque, swing high, swing low, you will you will have to sell your dream, your soul, your power just for bread and butter and shelter," unquote. In a pragmatic way, Mustique convinces Macaque that they will need money to fulfill the dream of returning to Africa. However, the delusion of the redeeming power evaporates when Macaque realizes that his dream of a white female muse is not provable. When he realizes that his vision is not visible to others, he loses his exceptionality. Thus, he becomes a shadow leader, only following Lestrade's orders. Previously, his dreams emboldened him for rebelling against Lestrade's authority. But when Macaque loses his moonlit fever, he also loses his zeal for resistance. In a pernicious manner, Macaque truly becomes Lestrade's monkey at the end of the apotheosis. With the epilogue, The play positions macaques' restored logical sense as more problematic than the absence of his white muse. Instead of proposing his own dream for his people's redemption, he becomes an apparition in the dream of his people. Even in questioning the valorization of reality, the play in the end cannot escape the division between reality and dream, since the disappearance of the white muse representing the Roman law of white Western history implies that the decolonized world is left with the challenge of creating a believable reference to the real. Even when Walcott endorses the Caribbean efforts towards achieving this reality, he refrains from floating a painless utopia about this daunting task. With this unresolved conflict, we are back to the question of assimilation that Walcott and Césaire struggled against in their own ways. Robert Hamner's article, dramatizing the New World's African King O'Neill, Walcott and Césaire and Christophe, 1992, compares the theatrical representation of one of the heroes of Haitian Revolution by Walcott in Henry Christophe, 1950, and by Césaire in the tragedy of King Christophe, 1963. Unsurprisingly, Christophe provides Césaire with a demiurgic lens through being an artificer of a world for his own people. This is applicable to Césaire, who attempted to endow his people with a national and racial identity as well as an indigenous theatre and audience, despite the European form of representation. Walcott is a more introspective version of the same mission, with his version of Christophe agonizing more intensely over the impact of his indecisions or decisions. Writing this play at the age of 19, Walcott shows his struggle for arriving at a voice of his own, reflective of Christophe here, while his mulatto identity and poverty appear to be overwhelming obstacles. He assimilated a European style by showing that, like Césaire, he also experimented with penetrating a white mask. Being seemingly unaware of the irony, however, Walcott dramatizes Christophe's inability to imagine a decolonized system that takes his community beyond European structures. Césaire's protagonist mediates this through a Brechtian theatre that foregrounds a revolutionary mode, which is Césaire's way of suggesting that the Haitian society cannot be forced into a European system. In the face of Christophe's myopic vision to fit the Creole heritage into a non-alienating structure, both Walcott and Césaire's nationalistic hero broaches the question of subverting the dominant culture without assimilating into it. As Hamner puts it, and I quote, Eugene O'Neill introduces Brutus Jones and his exotic setting into the mainstream of 20th century theatre. But he portrays an aspect of the human soul, searching the limitations of a historical or racial cipher. It is left to Walcott, although with a touch of naivety, and Césaire, in light of Négritude, to exploit Christophe's tragic example, the dangerous implications for Black consciousness and for the political aspirations of the entire third world, unquote. Indeed, the challenge for the entire decolonized world is to know the parameters of their dependence on Western sociocultural and knowledge-based systems, and yet advance the experience and aptitude for creating a mode of existence that incorporates the diverse ethnicities, races, and interest groups within the decolonized societies. From this perspective, Césaire's loyalty to Martinique and his affinity to the French metropole remain both exemplary and unsettling. In 2008, Maeve McCosker invites another renowned Martinican author, Patrick Chamoiseau, to comment on the duality at Oxford University on the occasion of the Martinique Week. McCosker points out that the funeral, according to Césaire, appeared to be an attempt to pantheonize the poet. Nevertheless, this cannot be unproblematically celebratory in the Antilles. Chamoiseau's reply is revealing, if not conclusive, and I quote him, "When a Martinican is famous in France, all Martinicans feel proud. So there was immense pride that the father of the nation should be considered important on a national level. This recognition goes against the thinking of Césaire, who, while very much attached to the French Republic, he had a great love for France, for Paris, always organized his life, his ideas, his center of reflection, first around Martinique and then around Africa. For me, even the state funeral was a moment of fairly blatant political assimilation. I think it's true that Césaire belongs to the history of France, but to a history that has cast off the shackles of colonialism, that is open to the rest of the world and ready to enter into this famous exchange of memories and experiences," unquote. Clearly, for Césaire to belong to Africa, France, and Martinique in a straightforward manner means erasing the unresolved elements of his thoughts, engagements, or strivings. The most poignant and familiar question regarding this still remains Césaire's Francophone writings, of course, which Chamoiseau admittedly emulates at his own peril, as he puts it. Granted that Césaire did not revolutionize French language, his aim was to revolutionize an indigenous form of belonging for the Martinicans so that they were assertive of their humanity. For me, Walcott, the painter, remains very effective for accomplishing this goal, for he foregrounds the ordinary people in his writings through taking recourse to the storytelling tradition of the Caribbean that renders each man a man and as good as any hero that passed in history. However, Walcott chooses to put on center stage those men who are usually considered social outcasts. Therefore, when the poet claims their individuality, his revolution is more significant. Makad, the charcoal burner, for example, comes out of the high forests of Saint Lucian. In the popular imagination, he's seemingly subhuman because of being associated with wild mountains. When he commands our attention as a significant fragment of this earth, we realize that Walcott adds to the decolonization movement by pressing on the idea of a more egalitarian, if not non-hierarchical world. Though, through the stage props, lighting, masks, and folk rituals, Walcott's style dramatizes the hitherto unrecognized possibility of an unaccommodated man claiming his humanity, for the decolonized world necessitates a more accommodating society. To conclude, Césaire and Walcott resolutely defend what Edward Glissant, another world stage Francophone writer and philosopher from Martinique, calls the Caribbean right to opacity vis-a-vis colonial systems in the region. This also means that we have to acknowledge that much of the Caribbean that they embrace as their own remains opaque to them. And they also have to come to terms with their inability to carry out epistemic justice to the decolonization movement of the Caribbean, given the limitations associated with the whole question of representation, or the system of representation, for that matter, as well as the mind-boggling diversity of the region. Consequently, the prevalent binaries, colonizer-colonized, opacity, relation, simultaneously persist and falter in their texts. These patterns survive through the author's devout anti-colonialism and collapse through their paradoxical awareness of their unresolved stance towards the power structure of colonial systems, their seemingly divided loyalties, and their giant and yet wanting imperatives. This is by no means a criticism. Instead, this is humbling to comprehend that decolonization movement requires us to follow in their footsteps more determinedly. It is undoubtable from any discussion, from my discussion today, that both the Caribbean poets aimed to incorporate the struggle of the oppressed people into the movement to build a new humanity. However, this did not fully materialize. Therefore, if we hope for a momentum in the decolonized movement, we have to relearn their method, which is about the previously colonized individual's duty to reconstruct his/her personhood for a future yet to come, where he/she can prove rather than simply declare his/her humanity through action. I should repeat, a lot of positive actions. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Rehnuma. That was absolutely brilliant. I don't know if we could all take a moment just to either, clap virtually in this space, but that was so brilliant. And there were so many layers to that. And so we just really thank you for taking the time to put this presentation together. I think you spoke a lot on various different aspects that are just so important for us to think about. Specifically, those of us who specialize in Caribbean studies, I was thinking about how you really elucidated Césaire's approach to decolonization, but also Walcott's vision and cultural strategy, which I found very, extremely powerful. And I thought, so we're going to open to questions. I just want to remind everybody that we are recording. If you do want to ask your question, please feel free to use the chat box function, or you can just use the raise hand function and I'll get to you. But yeah, we are recording, but do feel free to turn on your cameras if you want to. But I will kick it off while everybody's just getting their questions together. Just really, Rehnuma, on that last point you said about the future, and I was thinking about decolonization today and what it means, and I thought, what you've offered here in comparing Césaire and Walcott's approach to decolonization. The question is, how can younger Caribbean writers build on both traditions without repeating them?
Thank you, Eve. It's a relevant question, and it is about probably going back to Patrick Chamoiseau, in a sense, because he provides us an effective example here. He says that he also looks at Césaire, and he himself, Patrick Chamoiseau, defines himself as a son of Césaire because he writes. He's also a francophone writer, but it's not blind, or it's not just unthinking emulation, I should say. It is building on an endeavor to probably first think the way Césaire thought about the reality of being a Martinican, because you have to think about your individuality first, and then you have to think about your connection to France, because yes, it is a departmental part of France. It has its tug of war. So that means that you have to locate yourself in your context, but then you have to locate yourself in terms of Europe, and then in terms of the world, and then if you're able in terms of the bigger questions related to decolonization movement itself. So lots of duties remain, and it's a constant visit, and a constant questioning. Césaire paved the way. He showed how to do it. He pointed out the circles involved. He pointed out the assertiveness that's necessary. He pointed out the historical dialogues which should be happening. So the younger ones, I should say, can now choose to either be a francophone writer or a creolite writer, but then they always have to find lots of imaginative ways to sort of expand these dialogues, to add to the circles, to experiment with the historical legacies, and to never to forget that it remains a duty, because the future is yet to come. So hopefully this makes sense a little bit.
Yeah, that does. Thank you. And I do believe that we have quite a few Francophone studies people here today, so hopefully we'll hear some questions from them as well. But we do have one in the chat from April Louise. It says, "Thank you for your interesting presentation. Could you speak a little about your own positionality in relation to this work and how it shapes your interpretation of Césaire and Walcott within an interdisciplinary decolonial framework?"
Thank you so much for this question. Yes, in terms of my positionality, I'm trying to come up with my own interpretation of decolonization, if you like. So yes, this paper is part of a bigger project, and that project sort of looks at the legacy that Césaire and Walcott created through defining decolonization as a moment of self-reform. So it is not about, because Walcott says that you can be a new Adam. He insists on becoming a new Adam without saying that this is a painless utopia. It is not. So I'm sort of so that's my, if you like, that's my interest in, or that's my way of intervening into the decolonization movement by saying that the movement has to, it probably doesn't have to start with, but it has to revisit the whole question of personhood, subjectivity, individual identity, because all of these definitions have already been framed by colonial discourses. So, and as I have tried to explain through Césaire and Walcott, when you start to take these discourses, not apart maybe, when you try to intervene into these discourses, you hit the ground, so to speak, by saying that then where are your sustaining structures? So I'm trying to, if you like, look at an effective way of intervention. And if I can take it a bit higher, so to speak, or at a more universal level, it is about looking at oppressive structures, and it is about intervening in those structures in a way that's believable, that's effective, that shows that your dreams don't have to turn into deliriums. You can make new imaginations possible. So how is it done? How is an intervention meaningful? And why would your voice linger, your voice stay in a structure that sort of defines the world, that still dominates the world, and that still sort of tries to organize the world in a hierarchical manner? So how can you still negotiate? How can you still make a fairer world possible? In other words, what I'm trying to say is that when you intervene into an oppressive structure in the Caribbean, does it also mean that creates an example for the rest of the decolonized world? So is that, in other words, I'm just saying that, is this to be translated in other contexts? So I'm not looking at the author's works just from a literary point of view. I am, in effect, looking for methods out of their writings, the methods which can be translated in terms of the whole decolonized world. So that's the aim. That's my interest, and that's my probably perspective as well.
No, that's perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you, April Louise, for that question. I see a raised hand from Wole, so please do feel free to unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. It was a really nice one, well packed, and you really unpacked them. I am fascinated by your comparison of Aimé Césaire and Derek Walcott, who are my playwrights from the Caribbean in my research, because I'm working on African and Caribbean drama. But the question I have is, it has to do with the future of the decolonial project.
Yeah.
And I am thinking that, looking at the style of Césaire, okay, I call it Césairian style, the Glissantian style, as well as the Chamoisian style, they tend to be different in their pursuit of this decolonial project. And I am tempted to call this a kind of ethical disposition, that is to say, ethical individuality. Now, I feel like for there to be
bientôt arriver, va bientôt se poser.
Je ne sais pas. 3 heures, il a dit.
Dans 3 heures, il va
me plaire. On a calculé que ça serait à...
Sorry, Eve, I don't have hosting powers.
Yeah, I'm trying to switch it up. I'm trying to work out who it is. There we go.
All right. Thank you. So,
apologies for that. Somebody had unmuted themselves, and we're having an interesting conversation. But over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, paying attention to this divergence in their style of writing, pushing their decolonial project individually, do you think that this will not actually turn into delusion, just as you've rightly positioned? And if that is the problem identified, is there any way you think could be proposed to have a kind of a consensus in their individual style? Thank you.
Thank you so much for this question. Yes, the consensus seems to be the style very much emerges from the need to stay on the line, so to speak, need to make sure that decolonization as a movement doesn't turn into delusion. So they're trying to develop different approaches, different stylistic strengths, and also different philosophies, though very much interconnected. So, but looking at Césaire and Walcott in comparison, it seems to me that they are sort of advocating and strongly advocating that whenever the structure sort of beats you down, for Walcott in particular, your art has to sort of give you the strength to imagine better, perhaps. So, in other words, and Césaire definitely, yes, Négritude sort of offers partial solution, but still, it is a spirit that doesn't die down. So there is something there as a protective measure, perhaps. So you have to find the encouragement. You have to source your imagination, and you have to understand that the structures are overwhelming, the obstacles are overwhelming as well. But then use whatever remains, whatever's at your disposal. So they tried in an artistic manner, they tried through different stylistic experimentations, but they never accepted defeat. They don't know what the future will look like. And they were also defeated by some of their own mechanisms, so to speak. It's not a criticism, I emphasize again and again, because we haven't created the decolonized world yet. And it's not just one person's struggle, and it's also not a third world struggle alone. It's a struggle to arrive at a better dawn for humanity, as Walcott puts it. So So I would say the work has just begun. So experiment more, believe more, strengthen your spirit, and go back to the foundational figures, not just for inspiration, for the method to do what they've got right. Yes, learn from what they perhaps haven't sort of cracked on perfectly, maybe. I mean, I'm just trying to say that try to re-employ them, use your own imagination, come up with more and more ways of intervening into oppressive structures. Sounds like an ethical sort of solution, but I think ethics has to work in conjunction with your style, with your method, with your philosophy. Yeah.
Thank you, Rehnuma, and thank you, Wale, as well. I actually had the same question, so I'm glad somebody asked that. Very important question. We have another one in the chat from Dr. Chandra Mohan. It says, any comments on the cultural diversities that colonialism and decolonization engendered? For example, the French colonization and de facto, so by law and in practice, decolonization, and not totally free indentured labour, when we're thinking about migration / movement, leading to Tamil-speaking diaspora in Martinique. It's a big question there.
Yes, and I'm trying to sort of yes, and that's also part of the problem. And there is a short answer to it, which is to reiterate what I've just said, in a sense, meaning what I've just explained, that diversity remains an overwhelming decolonization related struggle, because as I have just explained, Négritude didn't manage to find a complete solution to address diversity. Walcott tried to experiment with his cultural strategies, but we also know that he also doesn't have all the answers. So it is about belonging and non-belonging at the end of the day, and then finding out what kind of a decolonized nation a territory wants to be. And for me, it has to keep the avenues of negotiation open so that more and more voices could come in. As I have been emphasizing, none of us have all the answers, but if we shut the sort of doors and windows by saying that the diversity question is improbable, or there are more and more variations, even within known settings and everything. So we cannot start a conversation. We cannot start a dialogue for finding solutions. And I think we have to, again, go back to the intention, maybe, that Césaire and Walcott sort of set up by saying that the intention has to be, it's easier said than done, I know, but still, for me, it's the only way forward. You have to find a way of accommodating everyone. You have to find a way of arriving at a system that's able to accommodate, that's able to look at the bigger picture, because we try to narrow down our focuses, because we try to sort of think of immediate outcomes. Maybe we try to think about interest groups, we try to think about instant solutions, but I think it is a matter of imagining better. It is a matter of negotiating more, and it is a matter of keeping alive what has worked. Meaning, I shouldn't say, because I should sort of clarify perhaps here that I'm pro Césaire here. Yes, African heritage matters. He never said that we should be exclusively defined by the African heritage, but there is a method to be discovered here. The method is that it is a way of being rootedness. So maybe the diasporans can start their own dialogue by coming up with ideas regarding rootedness, so that it's not just Césaire has worked, he doesn't work anymore. He does work when you think about the intervention as a method, as a form of philosophy, as a form of as an intention to find a way forward, rather than sort of going back and saying Négritude is it suggests essentialism. Therefore, there are these varieties of diasporic people, and how can they fit in and everything. So all I'm saying is that go back to Césaire, look at the spirit he built up, look at the aim, and look at the sincerity through which he struggled to find a meaningful existence. And probably we can sort of start to build on that again. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to highlight, Eve has quoted something you said, Rehnuma, which I just think is so powerful, and kind of ties in with what you were just talking about. You said, we have to find the strength to imagine better. And I think that's just so as Eva said, very poignant observation there. So thank you for that. We have another question in the chat from Hannah. It says, thank you for your interesting presentation. You mentioned that both Walcott and Césaire acknowledged what Glissant called the right to opacity.
Yes.
Could you maybe elaborate a bit more on the similarities and differences between Glissant's concepts and Walcott's and Césaire's?
Thanks very much. That's also a very good question. Glissant comes to our mind whenever we think about the right to opacity. And Glissant is more direct, I should begin by saying. More direct meaning he's just saying, and he said it has to be part of the decolonizing discourses, because we start by assuming that we have the capacity to explain why the cultures intermingle, why the cultures influence each other, why sometimes the cultures come together, why there are clashes. So Glissant is suggesting that we have to begin elsewhere. We have to begin by admitting that we'll never know some of the answers. So that's the right to opacity, and that's Glissant is saying that that's also the adventure maybe of writing, of imagining, of creating, of entering into dialogues, all of these avenues, because we start by assuming that these are the known structures. How will we survive if the structures go away? No one's saying the structures have to go away. So Glissant is saying that we have to begin elsewhere. We have to begin by saying that we know the structures haven't been successful, but we also know that we don't know all the answers. So granted that we probably, I'm trying to sort of widen Glissant's interpretation a little bit. We probably will never arrive at a fully satisfactory answer, but the search must go on. And here, I think the struggle that Walcott sort of projected, and the experience, and also the example that Césaire set up. You see, Césaire himself never understood his own opacity regarding French cultural heritage, because he hasn't explained, he hasn't because he used Creole language, but it's like everyone looks at him as a giant francophone writer, fine, but why French language? And so there's opacity involved there, and there are no satisfactory examples why he thinks in circles, like as a Martinican first, then as a French citizen, and then as a perhaps world citizen. So you can learn from those impacts, but you can also sort of go back to Césaire and say that he's actually dealing with his own opacity, because we can't actually come up with an explanation for Césaire that this is the reason why my appreciation for French language is greater than my appreciation for Creole language, maybe. So, but again, Glissant offers you with some tools to sort of look at Césaire in an effective way by saying that that's his right to opacity. You probably don't need to sort of sort out everything regarding his choice of a language, maybe his fascination with Paris as a city. So that's his right to opacity, which Césaire, so that's the difference. Glissant gives us a tool, Césaire sort of leaves us wondering. And if we go back to Walcott, again, Walcott comes to the Caribbean, so to speak, because I'm conscious when I'm saying that he comes to the Caribbean, because he has different routes to enter into the Caribbean. And his right to opacity is exemplified when he demands that he himself is an example of a successful Caribbean experimentation, meaning cultures can coexist. He is a successful experimentation. So his right to opacity will be, I myself work as an example of not knowing why the diversity question works successfully in a context, why it doesn't work in another context. So all I'm trying to suggest here is that, yes, Walcott proved that he's a successful experiment, but he's also proving that the right to opacity has to remain there. In other words, he cannot sort of, he never asked to copy himself. All he's saying is that this gives him strength that the Caribbean as a diverse region can set an example of not being defeated by unpredictable historical legacies. So, but then why am I bringing in the question of opacity in here? Because he's just saying that it sometimes works, it sometimes doesn't work. Walcott is a successful example. So maybe there are links to be made here. Through Glissant, we may revisit Walcott and say that the experimentation worked through Walcott because obviously he had, I should say, immense strength as a poet, as a playwright, as a painter. So maybe these are the reasons why he was able to transcend historical obstacles better in an improved way. Again, that's also not a guarantee. So the right to opacity will say that we can borrow from his example, but we also have to know that he's not a masterpiece by saying that this is how identity. All I'm trying to say that he's no definitive example. He is an example, and other examples can happen. So right to opacity works in his case in a different way. Hope this answers the question in some ways.
Thank you, Rehnuma. Yes, I learned a lot there just listening to you. So thank you so much. I want to make a little shift and ask another question myself. Make a little shift toward literature, because I'm somebody who believes that both cultural creation and political resistance are equally powerful forms of decolonization. But I wondered if you could expand a little bit from your perspective and reading of Césaire and Walcott, what you may be able to clarify as limitations or even the benefits, limitations or benefits to literary and artistic resistance in confronting whether it be economic or political inequalities.
It's a very good question. Thank you, Renee, for this. I should say, I mean, if I am inspired by both the writers, obviously. So, and I think when I look at them, this sort of answers your question in a straightforward manner. In a sense, why do they inspire? why do we revisit Césaire and Walcott? There's something there, right? To put it in a frank manner, perhaps. So words, yeah, they have contexts, but they live on. And words, artistic creations, imaginations, they do not have to always work spatio-temporally. What I'm trying to say is it doesn't have to be Caribbean as such. It doesn't have to be Martinican as it does, because it sort of talks to that, it represents that context, that time, the trouble, the struggle. But then words also connote. Arts also convey more than the context, more than the subject matter. So there are lots of different avenues into art, into creativity, into word, into imagination. So you can, once you have created something, once your imagination is successful, it's for posterity, so to speak. So you can revisit, you can re-engage, you can adapt, you can question, you can dialogue, you can disagree. But I know of no great literature that doesn't highlight hope. So probably I could put it this way. So they remain, and the constant sort of need to engage and to fathom and to excavate and to relearn and to rediscover and to reimagine. So yeah, that'll be my answer.
Thank you.
Just to add,
yes,
I don't think you can find, maybe music. You can probably add music. So what I was thinking of technology. You probably won't be able to replace technology in this context. Do I make sense? Because it's not part of the technology's mission or ability or even the parameter to deliver on these grounds. Okay.
Yes, I completely agree. I think what you said about reimagination is a really key point when you're thinking about literary or just generally artistic resistance. And I do think it's something that literature or music or art can achieve, whether other forms of equally powerful, resistance cannot. And so I do think it's really important that we engage with writers like Césaire and Walcott, but also artists and musicians and thinking about ways that we can reimagine resistance, because I think that's actually key to some of the conversations and some of the points you've raised already on how we can further the decolonial project today. I think it's within that reimagination and trying and experimenting, as you've already said as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
We have another question in the chat. It's from Anissa, who says, how do you feel the continuity of open negotiations compare within the Middle East and the Caribbean from a decolonial standpoint?
Very good question. Yes, because I'm familiar with both the contexts, because I've written on the Middle East and the Caribbean, it looks like, there are two sort of aspects here. To look at the Middle East and look at the Caribbean as geographies, as locations, as diversity-oriented groups, maybe. So it'll arrive at factual answers, I should say. Because then you can sort of say that, yes, there can be negotiations, and then the decolonial standpoint will not always be the same because of all the differences, all the layers of expectations, all the political realities, all of these things will get in the way. But if you look at the Middle Eastern intellectuals, if you look at the Caribbean intellectuals, you realize that the goal is always the same. To arrive at an unheard of future. Unheard of is not apocalyptic, because we are thinking of Césaire today. We are thinking of apocalyptic in a productive way. No one's saying shut down the world. Everyone's saying that shut down the old systems. so that a new humanity can emerge. And no one has proclaimed that I have found a new humanity where everyone sort of is happy, everyone's sorted, everyone's negotiated, everyone's just, so no. So again, the answer will be the same. Find a way in, start a negotiation, because we have to keep developing these interventions, these methods, these questions, these conversations. Yeah. So yeah, the answer is to sort of go back and find various ways, various methods, various stylistic means of insisting on the emergence of a new humanity. And Fanon has already provided us with an answer where your difference doesn't have to determine who you are. Or maybe your sameness. It's not just your difference, not even your sameness. So how will you define yourself? Your actions, your words, your intentions, your contributions, your connections to various communities, and your contributions at the end of the day. So yeah, if we think about negotiations from these perspectives, then I think we have better opportunities.
Thank you. Amazing. We have a really interesting question here, and I'd be really interested to hear the answer from you, Rehnuma, from Dr. Chandramahan. I really hope I'm saying your name correctly. Apologies if I'm not. How to reconcile opacity and the third space, thinking about Homi Bhabha, both point to a new beginning.
Yes. Thank you, Bala, for this question. Yes. Both are methodical, but then the third space is not actually asking us to think about the option of not knowing something. The third space is sort of pointing out a very specific location. It is a method, but it is sort of saying that how about if we are thinking of Bhabha, we are thinking about the binary between the colonizer and the colonized, and Bhabha is sort of arguing that how about not belonging to any sides? How about standing in the middle? So he has a very specific answer. But if you look at Glisson, he'll say, where is the middle? How do you know how to find the middle? So that's the difference for me. And I think that both the methods have values in their own ways, and both are interventionist, because you can be then through Bhabha, you can be specific. Through Glisson, you have the freedom to sort of negotiate your own third space. Hope this makes sense.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think we could have a whole separate conversation just on that, because I think that's such an interesting question. So thank you both. We have another one from Jean, who says, are you looking in an integral way at the decolonial/colonial issues, the colonizing territories as well?
Yes, that's a very pertinent question, because that's this is where I'm going with this project. I'm not just looking at territories or colonial issues. I'm trying to find an integrated way of not going around the entire world, obviously, to connect the Caribbean to the Latin American context and also to the South Asian context, and to point out how actually the struggle there is an arrow mark, because the different kinds of struggle, they are sort of pointing towards the north, so to speak, the north I'm searching for, obviously. And that, for me, that north will be to come up with a definition of a decolonized subjecthood. What will that subject do? What will that personhood look like? And what will happen if you redefine yourself? How will you then negotiate the colonial issues, the structures, the systems, the expectations? So yeah, this is where I hope I'm going.
Thank you so much. Well, I don't see any more questions. I mean, do feel free to just interrupt me if you do have one. But I wanted to just take some time just to say thank you, Rehnuma, for the wonderful presentation. And thank you all for your questions. I think today's discussion on Césaire and Walcott reminds us that decolonization is not a single event marked by independence or political change, but it's a long and complex process that unfolds in our minds, in our cultures and in everyday life. And I think that it's important to reflect on these ideas. The discussion also invites us to see decolonization not as a closed chapter, as you've really emphasized there, not as a closed chapter of history, but as an ongoing responsibility, which I think we all share in. So thank you so very much for the depth, nuance that you've given to this conversation. We really very much appreciate it.